So, to begin, I was very curious about this matter, and I went into the works of H. Horton Wiley. It was probably my third reading of the entire works of H. Horton Wiley. H. Horton Wiley, if you don't know, is the first official theologian of the Church of the Nazarene. Okay, if you don't know what his position in end times was throughout his lifetime, he was a pre-tribulation premillennialist, which is the same camp that I'm in and my mom and the ministry that I'm under. We believe that same position. Okay, so as he was doing his research, people are all over the board when it comes to Bengel and his influence, and you're going to hear kind of that variation as I discuss it. But I want you to know that the first time I ran into that basic information from Wiley on what he believed, where he believed Bengel was, as I was going through his his theology works, he brought him up under premillennialism. Okay, and so I was like, okay, here we go. This is a man as late as his works, if you don't know, were written between 1932 and 1940 in the Church of the Nazarene. That's when they were published. And as late as 1932, 1940, you have a person putting Bengel's writings under premillennialism. All right, and so as early now we need to know how early they were doing that. What did they consider John Bengel in his own day? Where would they put him? Okay, well, as I started to look further and further back, I noticed that that's where they put him. They put him under premillennialism. When I brought that up to Ken Collins and I asked him, I said, what do you think about that? To me, that's the first question that needs to be answered before we go trying to tackle the one about John Wesley. He said, that doesn't matter to me. He said, but I want to ask you, does it matter to you? Do you think that's as important a point as I think it is? I mean, if John Wesley's main influence on, his notes on the New Testament, especially particularly the book of Revelation and Matthew and the different points in the New Testament where Jesus discussed end times, was under the influence of Bengel, then don't you think it's important to figure out where Bengel stood on that issue? Okay, well, here's some earlier sources, okay, that I found, other than H. Horton Wiley. There's a man named Robert Culver, and he notes that the German Lutheran scholar Bengel, okay, so there he is, he brings him up, was, quote, credited with making the word, and I mean the word millennium, respectable in Europe in the 18th century. Now, guys, any postmillennialists would not be known for making the Kiliist position of the original church. Kiliism is from the Greek word, millennium, and they called people Kiliists before they called them premillennialists. A person who's in a postmillennial position would not be known in history for setting the millennium back in front of people's faces as though it's a literal thing to happen. Okay, that's what he's saying there. Okay, so that would put Bengel under the heading of premillennialist, not postmillennialist. And Charles Ryrie. Now, Ryrie is closely associated with Darby, Schofield. These are the big names under the influence of dispensationalism. But Charles Ryrie put it there. He said, the modern period has witnessed the rise of premillennial teaching. Here we go again. He doesn't put them under postmillennialism. He puts them under premillennialism. A number of commentators, and then he puts in parentheses like John Bengel and Henry Alford wrote from this viewpoint. Okay, so there we go again. An early commentator, and he's putting that, John Bengel was a premillennialist. Another observes that I found, and I didn't put down this man's name. You can actually look up the exact words. You'll find the quote online. On the other hand, this other individual says, he was soundly criticized by contemporary Lutheran scholars for his defense of an earthly millennium and literal fulfillment of prophecy. Okay, so those 2 points are sub-points under a premillennial view. And then, I don't know if I wrote this or the man wrote it that I was quoting, not a bad thing for which to be criticized. All right, then we go on to a direct source, okay, and you can look this one up as well. An early copy of 1913 of the Christian Workers Magazine, a pre-millennial defense magazine, okay, it stated this about John Bengel. To the above list of premillennialists that he had already given in the source might be added the name of Dr. Bengel, okay? author of Nomen Novi Testamenti, this is one of his major writings on the New Testament, who says, quote, the early church, this is John Bengel, fully believed that it, and then he says the second coming, would precede, which would be the millennium, or usher in the 1,000 years of his reign with his saints. A general change of view came in after the establishment of Christianity under Constantine, and when corruption in doctrine and practice had begun. All right, so he's this early writer again in 1913 is putting Bengel underneath the premillennial view. All right, and there's so many more sources along this line. Let me show you. Another one is if you go into the Seventh-day Adventist Church, you'll find one of the key people that wrote on the history of premillennialism. I think her name was Ellen White. She has a source on this history, and she as well puts Bengel as one who was contradicting the influences of the primary author who, brought to a system in later days the postmillennial view. Okay, and so it goes on and on. The more you study it, the more you'll find the same thing. And so let's read what Nathaniel West, the one I started with, said. He said, Nathaniel West, summarizing all of Wesley's upbringing, including both Fletcher and Bengel, as ardent premillennialist and the father of premillennialism, he says, Wesley's whole training could produce no other result, that he was a premillennialist. His father was a premillennialist, which is true. I will demonstrate that to you as well. The English church to which they both belonged was such from the days of the Great Reformation. All the early Oxford Methodists were the same, and tenacious not only of the Articles of Faith, but of King Edward's Catechism, composed by Cranmer, and premillennial to the core. The Moravians of Feather Lane in London, whom Wesley joined, were premillennialists, as were the Moravians and Pietists in Germany, whom Wesley visited and where he found, quote, a heaven to his soul. The orphan house of August Hermann Frank was full of blessing. It was personally acquainted with Zinzendorf, and that missionary miracle of grace, Christian David. Christian David was the one that taught Wesley two works of grace the first time in a systematic way. The two men were the means of Wesley's conversion prior in 1738, and David taught him two works of grace. After his 14 years of legalism, were Peter Böhler, ordained by Zinzendorf, and Martin Luther, whose preface to the Romans was blessed to the full salvation of his soul, both premillennialists. Okay, so he's saying Luther and Zinzendorf and other key leaders were all premillennialists around Wesley. Spangenberg, August Hermann Spangenberg, a devout Moravian, was his bosom friend. His brother Charles Wesley was the premillennial poet of the church, and like so many other sacred poets of the time, sang in thrilling numbers the coming king. And he did. Many of his hymns are in that camp. The immortal Fletcher, John Fletcher, who was going to be Wesley's follow-up man, dear to his heart, was one of the most rapturous and thoroughgoing premillennialists ever known. So was Wesley's friend, the vicar of Bexley. Bengel, his great teacher, there it goes, and guide, was the father of modern premillennialism. That's a quote. He quotes that, the father of modern premillennialism. I wish I could find the source of that quote. I've looked for it, haven't found it yet. And then he goes on. So he says, think of it, Luther, Bengel, Frank, Zinzendorf, Böhler, Spangenberg, and David, their early fathers, the memories of Cranmer, Latimer, and Ridley, all going to make up Wesley. How else could he speak of Justin's Creed? How else of Hartley's book? The two primary quotes that they use when they're quoting Wesley to even support that he had premillennial leading were the quote he made of the early church father Justin's Creed and of Thomas Hartley's book. Okay. Now, here's his direct section on John Albite Bengel. Such the name of Wesley's great guide in exegesis and prophecy, and without whom we had never seen Wesley's notes on the New Testament, and especially upon the Apocalypse, which is Revelation. There's not a university in the world where Bengel's works and name are not held in the highest honor. The greatest of scholars have knelt at his shrine. He led the whole Christian church in exposition of the sacred scriptures. To be praised by the great will be his lot while time lasts. To whom do we owe it? Asked Delitzsch, that the Orthodox Church of the present time no longer brands premillennialism. See, we have as early as Bengel wrote. Okay, it's the viewpoint that he's a premillennialist as a heresy, so that there is scarcely a believing Christian now who does not hold it. All right, so no longer do they think of premillennialism as a heresy, Now there's scarcely a Christian who does not hold it, and it's all Bengel's responsibility. He's saying we owe it to Bengel. It is of Bengel, Professor Domer says, his works were the first cock crowing of that kind of exegesis the church so much needed. It is Luthard who says, long time had the study of the prophetic word in its true light been unknown to the church. In Bengel, the conscience of the church lifted a loud cry against the neglect of the apocalypse. From Bengel, the light gleamed out over the Old Testament also and opened up a brighter view into the times of earthly completion of the church. Nathaniel West lived from 1826 to 1906. In that writing, again, here's the exact correct title, John Wesley on Premillennialism. It's printed in recent days by First Fruits Press, and that's page 26 and 27. So today, guys, if Johann Bengel was a postmillennialist, as people today are suggesting, then when you would study end times, you would get this feel that a revival was the millennium, and you get this feel that Christ isn't going to return to a corrupt and worrisome world, but rather a world that's corrected itself through the ministries of the present gospel, okay? And you don't find that in the descriptions. Even when you look him up on Wikipedia, this is some of the information you'll find there. He was known in his era as the father of premillennialism, as I stated before. It's stated that after reading his 3 works on the book of Revelation, German pietists were selling their homes. This is what it says about it. Their homes and moving for safety due to the near return of Christ. He predicted an exact date, which would be an argument for premillennialism, June 18th, 1836. So they were scared, They were moving away from the Pope, and they wanted to move. That's the response you would make to a person who's telling you, kind of like they tease when they're teasing a premillennialist, the sky is falling. He's the type of person that's giving a warning. And it says, yes, the Lutheran and Pietist premillennialists had people scared that bad, okay? Bengel met Count Zinzendorf. I don't know if you know that. There's a point where he was impressed with Zinzendorf. Zinzendorf was the head of the Moravian camp, Herrnhut, where Wesley learned about 2 works of grace, okay? And spent some time there in 1739, 1740, and even earlier than that, traveling with them on his way to America and so forth, even prior to his conversion. And the Moravians were responsible for influencing Wesley towards salvation. But, Bengel actually met Zinzendorf, Wesley's contemporary, and attempted to show him his calculations relating to the end of the world in 1733. That's when that happened. The Count was not impressed, with trying to come to terms with a date. Sometimes that bothers people. Neither was Bengel with amongst other things, the devotional practices of the Herrnhuters. If you remember, they got into the stillness controversy around that time, so that might have been what set Bengel off a little bit from him. Yet, yes, this group, living under the Lord's protection, forced out of Bohemia and Moravia, and also premillennialists, had drawn Bengel's attention. He wrote a book on them. It was called Briss der Brudergermanie in German, 1751, and kept contact with them throughout his life. He rejected their claim to be, quote, the eschatological community, but still felt Zinzendorf should be concerned with this matter. So, he was pushing premillennialism. Just they had disagreements about subjects about it, okay? He puzzled, quote, amongst all art in our times who accept the kingdom of God, the literal earthly millennial reign of Christ, there's no one for whom a fundamental insight into the apocalypse would be more necessary than the good Count, okay? So, he sounds like he's giving supportive statements to some of the beliefs of premillennialism that Zinzendorf held. Bengel's end times predictions were, quote, based less upon an event of the medieval papacy than it was Bengel's own experience of his own time, as the end time Carter Lindbergh writes.